My name is Amy, and I assure you the following event is true and actually happened to me in the spring of 2015. I will, to the best of my memory, relay the horrifying events of that day and the successive days after it. Please keep in mind, it has been nearly 4 years since this occurrence, so I may forget or otherwise unintentionally leave out certain aspects of the tale. So with all that said, here's the tale of that awful day. For context, I'll tell you readers a small bit of my background, in order to make the rest make more sense. Since my early teen years, I had been a hardcore runner. Regardless of the surface or distance, I've probably at least attempted it. My favorite style is trail running by far. I love the constant change of elevation and last-second decision-making involved in it. I will admit, at times I'm not very pleased about running in the mud. More than once, I've ended up falling rear end over tea kettle after slipping on an especially muddy corner, but thankfully the area I live in stays relatively dry. Now that I've got the preliminaries out of the way, I'll get to the real story. The day this all happened, I was running a long course in a park not far from my apartment. The park was actually more of a natural preserve. It was made up of 10 acres of prairie and the remainder was made up of forest. The forest took up a good 20 acres or so and had all types of trails, dirt and concrete. I, of course, spent my time on the dirt trails and had broken them into several different courses. The trail I was on consisted of 2 miles of open grass and the remainder, 5 miles, was all forested. I'm well aware that it sounds as if I'm stringing you along, but I promise it will make sense soon. Anyway, I just started to run and was making good time as I entered the woods. The first leg of the course was relatively flat and continued on for at least a mile. The day wasn't too hot, about 85 degrees, but the light breeze blowing through the trees felt good. Once I blew through that first section, I entered the longest section. This length was very up and down. You had to cross at least 2 small creeks and it ended at a large hill. When I crossed the first creek, I was able to see the big hill far in the distance. You couldn't always see this far, but this was happening in the very early spring, so the foliage was still thin on the trees. I was happy to see no one else was running or hiking the trail that day. Sometimes I would have to detour or slow down in order to avoid others, but today the whole park appeared to be empty. It couldn't have taken me more than 15 seconds to get through that section and downhill to the second creek bed. As I approached the creek, I slowed a bit and turned my body slightly to the right so I could sidestep down the hill. When I was about halfway down the hill, someone tried to tackle me. I'm not sure exactly where he was hidden. I do know there was a large oak tree and other bushes growing up at the top of the hill, at the inside corner, the corner I was facing. Regardless, I was struck from the right side. He was likely hiding there. Regardless of his hiding place, I felt that I had been sideswiped by a bull. He had knocked me a good 5 yards across the creek and into the water. Luckily, there was barely any water in the creek, so I had no chance of drowning. As a matter of fact, I think it was the cool water that kept me conscious. Somehow, it wasn't long before I regained my wits about me and tried to get up. It was definitely painful, but by now my fight or flight instincts were kicking in. It was obvious to me that he hadn't tackled me because he wanted to talk. As I propped up my elbows, I looked over to the figure out where he landed. His body was laying almost upside down, his head pointing to the water. In my opinion, he had drastically underestimated how hard he had hit me. He looked to have slammed into the bank of the creek at a corner. His eyes were flickering open and closed, I guess waking after being knocked out, but I wasn't sure how long he'd stay that way. So I struggled to my feet and began jogging back up the trail the way I had just come from. Every step was painful. I was more hobbling than running, but I just wanted to get back to my car. When I finally reached the first creek, I glanced back to see if he was behind me, but he was not. I chose to jump to the other bank instead of going up and down each side. The landing caused me to buckle and fall, but by this time, my adrenaline was pumping too much. My hope was that I could get out into the open and get help from someone, or at least get to my car and get away. The flat section ahead was much easier to pass through. However, when I was about halfway through it, I could hear him yelling. I'm not sure what he was saying, but he certainly sounded angry. I was well aware that if he wasn't as hurt as me, he'd be able to catch me quickly. Thinking about this just forced me to push myself harder. My stubbornness paid off as I broke out from the trees and onto the small patch of grass leading to the parking lot. When I looked up, I caught sight of a couple getting out of their truck. I used every ounce of effort I had left by yelling at them, but they had already seen me. After hobbling another 20 yards or so, I fell to the feet of the wife and started bawling my eyes out. I stopped long enough to give them a very quick synopsis of what had happened. The whole time I was sitting in the grass, I was expecting my attacker to come out of the woods, but he never did. The husband of the couple called 911, and in a matter of minutes, I was on my way to the hospital. When the officers arrived at the ER, I told them everything that had happened and described my attacker as well as I could. They did mention in passing that a suspicious man had been seen hanging around the park recently, and my attacker may have been the same man, but I never discovered if they were one and the same. After they left, I broke down into another crying episode, but this time it was out of joy. I've never been so happy to be alive. As far as injuries, I got off with bruised ribs and a slight concussion. The rest was just sore muscles. In the weeks and months that followed, I spent a fair amount of time and money on counseling. I didn't think it would be a wise decision to carry around all that fear and anger for the rest of my life, and as a result, I've been able to go back to that park and run those trails again. With, mind you, pepper spray in my fanny pack. I had considered carrying a gun, but I figured it would just slow me down. Despite my lighthearted joking, do not think I don't take that incident and incidences like this seriously. I've just always believed humor is a great way to deal with stress. Like I said, I did eventually make it back to the park and their awesome trails. I was determined early on not to let some psycho ruin my favorite hobby for me, and he wasn't. When it came to my attacker, he was caught a year later all the way across town attempting to assault a young woman in another park's restroom. His predilection for parks tipped the police off that he may have been the same guy. They leaned on him for an hour or two before he admitted to attacking me. He also added this little gem to his confession and told the cops that he had broken 2 ribs and got a concussion from tackling me. I admit, I couldn't help but laugh at that one. Myself and my family have always made activity in the outdoors a top priority. My parents had passed on their love for the outdoors to me, and I paired it with my infatuation with running. Together, these two activities have ensured the health and fitness of us all since my wife and I met at a 5K race, as it happens. The wife was one of those new moms sporting one of those running strollers, insistent on being back on the road within a few weeks after the birth of our first child. This was the pattern after she had each one. Her persistence has always been one of the biggest things I loved about her. As our kids grew older, they would each join us on our daily runs, taking in the clean air while their peers locked themselves away playing games, slowly becoming more and more obese. While running was never required in our home, we certainly did our best to encourage some form of outdoor physical activity. 2 of our children also chose to play extracurricular activities at school, and their coaches always insisted that them growing up jogging had helped them greatly. Our oldest made all-state in his age group, and despite winning a full scholarship for basketball, he still spent the majority of his time focusing on the cross-country team. I bring up our oldest especially because it was he that I was helping in training for a half marathon when the whole family was present to witness a horrible and ultimately sad event in the history of our family, an event that would fail to be overshadowed until the death of my beautiful wife to cancer. As I said, I was assisting in the training of our oldest son for a yearly half marathon that we have locally to benefit breast cancer. I definitely didn't mind helping him train. Besides, I had tidbits of experience to pass on to him since I had won this very same half when I was his age, not once, but twice. On this day, I had been in the park running some drills with him when my wife and our 2 younger daughters joined us. We all had decided to take a quick couple of laps over our favorite 5-mile path and then race back home for dinner. The loser would have to do the dishes. I knew my daughters hated doing the dishes, so I figured they'd be extra motivated to win. Anyway, we were all about halfway through our first circuit when we ran into a family friend, Craig, about 20 yards ahead of us. He wasn't in any real hurry, so we waved and said hi as we all passed him. He kindly waved back and went back to listening to his Walkman. Unfortunately, there was a section of our loop that required us to cross a street. It wasn't an especially busy street, but I never liked stopping to activate the crosswalk signal. Since I was at the front of the pack with my son, I ran up ahead and pushed the button so the others could cross traffic without having to stop. As usual, traffic was light, so I didn't have to wait more than a few seconds for the signal to light up. When it did, I continued my running through the intersection and back into the other side of the park. The rest of the family was close behind and also were able to get across the street quickly. By the time they reached the street, Craig had caught up and was close behind my wife, who was running anchor at the back of the pack. My guess was that he had sped up to avoid having to wait for the light. The truth is, the citizens had been trying to get the city to move the intersection further down the road and away from the park for years. Many of the parents were concerned because their children often had to cross that street to get to the ball fields. The fact is, no one liked that intersection. When Craig reached the street, he was only 10 yards at the most behind my wife and moving at a rapid pace. Craig made it to the center island of the street and made it about another 2 feet before he was struck by a car. The car was going at least 50 miles per hour when it hit him. His body rolled up the hood and then back to the ground in a matter of seconds. The worst part was that the car continued to move another 20 yards or so before it stopped, dragging Craig underneath it the whole way. Of course, we ran to help Craig and make sure that he was okay, but he wasn't. I'll admit that that second, I wanted to grab the driver from the car and beat the life out of them. But once I realized that the driver was just an old woman who could barely see over the steering wheel, my fury turned to disgust tinged with pity. She sat in the car, too scared to get out. You could see the utter fear in her eyes. I quickly composed myself and approached her window. While I did this, my wife was speaking to the 911 dispatcher, telling her the situation. I did my best to talk calmly to the poor woman and ensure her no one would hurt her. We did need her to back her car up a little so the paramedics could treat him. As I spoke to her, it seemed like she didn't totally get what I was saying. I was beyond feeling sorry for her at this point. I pulled her door open and reached for the shifter and put the car into neutral. The whole time she continued to have a lost look on her face. Once it was out of gear, I yelled up to my son to carefully push the car backward and off of Craig. I could hear the sirens getting closer as I put the car into park and took the keys and put them in my pocket. The last thing I wanted was to have this senile woman hurt anyone else by driving away. My son checked his pulse and, although being weak, it was there. Craig wasn't conscious at the time, but we were optimistic because he was still breathing when the ambulance took him away. When the police showed up, they questioned us all about what we saw. I took one of the officers aside and told him what I suspected about the old woman. He went to the car and spoke with her for just a moment and then returned to talk to his partner. They decided to contact a family member to come pick her up, and they would tow the car to the police garage to look it over for malfunctions. She was obviously not competent and shouldn't have been driving anywhere else. After talking to her again for a little while, they finally were able to get the number for her daughter. They called her to pick her up, and once she arrived and realized what had happened, she was horrified. The entire time all this was going on, the old woman didn't ask what was going on or say sorry or anything. She sat with a blank look on her face, totally oblivious to her surroundings. Her family had to have noticed her condition at some point before she got this bad. Either that or they had been neglecting her. I'm still not sure which is worse. When we were finally allowed to go, we all headed to the hospital. Once it was known where he was going, the officer had called Craig's wife, Melissa, to notify her of the accident and at which hospital he would be going to. She was an awful mess when we got there. Craig was in surgery and they had little hope he'd survive. We stayed with her until the doctor came out 2 hours later to tell us he had passed. The collision had done way too much damage for them to repair. I decided it would be better if I took the kids home, and my wife wanted to stay with Melissa to provide support. On the way home, it seemed right to discuss the situation with my children and gauge how they were coping with it. Despite being in their later teens, I wasn't sure how something so horrible would affect them, especially my twin daughters, who were only 14 at the time. To my surprise, they were all sad, of course, but recognized death was a part of life and something that could catch up to us at any time. I was so surprised by their mature way of handling it. Children never cease to amaze me. My wife stayed with Melissa for a few days and joined the rest of us for the funeral. Melissa continued to live in our neighborhood for another 3 months before she chose to move her and their young son back east to be near her mother. When it comes to the old woman, I do know she was never charged with any crime related to the death of Craig. Most of the information I've attained comes from news reports in the following days and months after his death. One particular article in the paper said that the authorities had deemed her incompetent and as a result decided not to seek charges against her. It also said that the 87-year-old would have her license revoked and in the future, she would be cared for by her daughter. My wife also told me that when Melissa was made aware the city wouldn't be charging the old woman, she wasn't mad. She was just happy to hear that she wouldn't be free to drive anymore and possibly harm anyone else. I think they should give that woman a medal. I can guarantee you that if some dotty old woman ran down my wife and got off scot-free, I wouldn't be calm about it. Then again, that's why women are better than us, and they are far kinder. Despite our sadness, we did our best to pick up where we had left off and live a good life. My son and I continued his training all the way up to the race. I'll save that story for another time, but I will say now that he did very well. I've prattled on long enough, so I'll wrap this story up. I guess I'll leave you all with a gentle little reminder. Please remember this: when you are driving your car, you have a responsibility to be mindful of those around you, whether that may be a bicycle, motorcycle, or on foot. Please remember that they are your fellow humans and deserve the same level of respect and caution you would give to another motorist. In other words, keep your head out of your butt and watch out for other people. Thank you all for taking the time of day to read this remembrance of an old friend. Please save a spot in your prayers for Craig's wife and child, and bless every one of you for reading such a long-winded story, written down by a lonely old man. I'm going to start this story by telling you not to give people the finger, especially when you're a pedestrian and they are in a car. Now I'll tell you why. At the time I had this particular run-in with a motorist, I was training to qualify for the Boston Marathon. I had been a runner since high school, but I had only recently been convinced to try for a major marathon. My friend that had talked me into it told me my first goal should be to time well in some local races first, so logically I signed up for an upcoming race in our town planned for a couple of months ahead. With the first step done, the next step was to run, and run some more. Since I saw that as the easy part, I trained as much as I could every day while trying not to overtrain. Considering I didn't have a coach, I had to get my information from books and magazines and the internet. Some of it was good, but most of it was terrible. By the second week, I decided to just create my own system based on my 20-plus years of experience, and it proved to be a wise choice. My times grew faster as my distances got longer. I had appeared to have come across a great thing. I'm still considering selling it. I'm very aware all of you reading this don't really give a flip about that stuff, but since I've seen other writers posting here use this format, I figured the whole starting with the background thing was the way to go. After all, I'm a runner and an engineer, not a writer. But on this day, I was doing my long-distance run, and the area I was in was a residential area not far from my place. On my long-distance days, I would run out 15 miles to the edge of town and then back to my house. This part of my routine was only done once a week because it was so exhausting, but I figured if I could run 30 miles, 26.2 should be easier. It didn't prove to be true, but you have to fail to learn. So I had made it out the 15 miles and was making my way back when I had the problem. I was still a good 10 miles from home, and I felt like I was about to hit the wall. I'm sure all the runners out there can tell their non-running friends what hitting the wall means. Anyway, I was trying with every fiber in my body from stopping when some jerk in an SUV sped up behind me on the road. Apparently I wasn't going fast enough for him, and he had to let me know. I was running in the bike lane, but I guess he felt the whole road belonged to him. He swung around me and leaned on his horn for 15 or so seconds as he passed me. At this point, I was barely hanging on and was in no mood for some smug jerk in a gas guzzler. Without thinking, I gave him the bird and thought nothing else about it. He must have taken issue with this gesture because I quickly heard the squealing of tires and saw him step down from his SUV and begin walking toward me. He was only about 5'5" and had a bit of a beer belly. When I first noticed this, I couldn't help but chuckle at the sight. He continued walking towards me with a twisted scowl on his face, the whole time saying nothing. We approached each other quickly because of each of our forward momentum, and once he got about a foot away from me, I began to tell him I was sorry and explain the situation to him. Before I could get one word from my mouth, I saw him pull back his right fist. The last thing I remember was the feeling of it smashing into my chin. Honestly, I'm not sure how long I was out, but when I finally got my wits about me, the guy in the SUV was gone. It also didn't take long for me to notice my side was also hurt. I can only assume he kicked me once or twice before he left. Luckily, I had landed on the grassy part next to the curb and not on the street where I could have hit my head and possibly died. I woke up in the grass, so that's the only conclusion I could come to. I doubt he was kind enough to place my body out of the road after he just kicked me around. It took a few minutes to get myself together before I started my walk home, but after a few minutes of walking, I called my buddy to come pick me up. On the ride back home, I explained what had happened, and he recommended I go to the police, but considering I had no license plate number or name for the guy, it would have been a waste of time. Besides, I couldn't help but believe it was my own fault anyway. In the area I lived, it's a bad idea to flip someone off, regardless of the reason. Folks don't take that particular gesture well. Because of my injuries, I wisely chose to take several days off from training. I also decided not to take that route again. I could never be certain that dude wouldn't drive up on me again and do the same thing or worse to me. Once I felt well enough to go back to running, I planned on some new routes and went back to work. I was somewhat jumpy when cars approached behind me on the road for a little while, but I was soon able to put the incident to the back of my mind and power ahead. When the time came for the local race, I ran it and placed decently. I continued entering in races and eventually made the qualifying time I needed, but I guess due to overwhelming numbers of qualifying applicants, I didn't make it, and to be honest, I'm glad I didn't. That was the 2013 marathon, and we all know what happened that year. I was a bit shaken up about what had happened, so I skipped the next year's race. However, the itch took over soon after the 2014 running, and I went back to work, and believe it or not, I made it into the 2015 race. It was the most fun I've ever had. If anyone out there had ever considered trying it, I say go for it. Since then, I've ran a few marathons each year. None as big as Boston, but I still enjoy them. Every day I step out of my door to run, I remind myself to keep control of my emotions and to treat others around me with the respect they deserve. I highly recommend you do the same in your daily life regardless of how you fill your day. You never know the quality of day the person next to you is having. He may have just caught his wife cheating or lost a loved one and is just waiting for someone to push him. Just by flipping another human the bird, you could end up just like I did. Or worse, you could lose your life. This story I'm about to post won't sound nearly as terrifying as many of the others I've read here, but I promise you, if you would have been in my shoes at the time this happened, any normal person would have been scared out of their minds, just as I was. That day was forecasted to be a rainy one, but by 9 a.m., the sun had come out and was its usual raging self. The road I was running on was somewhat off the beaten path, and due to this, the traffic was very light. My other reason for being on it was because of the stomach flu I had just gotten over. Normally, I wouldn't have dreamed of going for a run if I was sick, but that day I woke up feeling great and was eager to take advantage of it. I hadn't run for almost 4 days, so I felt it was important to get back into the swing of things. What does this have to do with having a stomach flu, you ask? Well, Any of the runners on here will tell you that sometimes you are forced to evacuate while running, and the road I was running on was wooded on both sides and relatively secluded. Therefore, if my bowels demanded release, I would run into the woods and do as I was told. Since this situation had occurred before, but in a much less convenient area, I was going to be ready this time. With that said, let's carry on. The section of road that I was on was a 5-mile circle. On most days I ran this area, I would double the distance, run in a circle twice, in other words, but under the circumstances, I decided to go light in case I started feeling ill again. I had made it 2.5 miles and was circling back to my car when I felt those familiar cramps in my stomach I had been experiencing for the last 3 days. Without hesitating, I made a dash into the woods on my right-hand side. I ran as far as I could into the woods before I was unable to hold it anymore. At that point, I yanked down my shorts and let go, just in time. It lasted a few minutes before the cramps finally let up. Once they did, I took the wet wipes from my pocket and cleaned up. This whole time, I had not looked forward. Mostly I was focused on the ground, begging for the pain to end, but once I had finished, I got the presence of mind to look around for anyone else. It wasn't like I was expecting any other people to be around, but my modesty seemed to take over. Just before I turned back toward the direction of the road, I half-heartedly scanned about 180 degrees in front of me and caught sight of a blue object about 40 to 50 yards away. Curious, I stopped to focus on what it was. After a couple of seconds, I realized it was a person, probably male, based on size, wearing what looked to be jeans and a blue jean jacket. His back was to me, and from what I could tell, he didn't know I was there in the woods with him. I continued watching him for a few minutes more when I realized he was digging with a shovel. When he stopped to remove his jacket, I crouched down behind a large tree in front of me. Now, I was starting to get nervous. I was a man, in an out-of-the-way part of the forest, digging a hole. This wasn't a little hole either. I stayed there behind that tree watching him for at least 15 minutes, and the only time he stopped was when he removed his jacket. Plus, he was there before I arrived, so he must have been burying something pretty big. Our soil was loose and sandy, so he could get deep in no time. I soon realized that the longer I stayed in those woods, the more likely it was that he would see me, and if he was doing what I thought he was, he'd have to do something to prevent me from going to the cops. Getting out of there sounded better and better the longer I stayed, so I waited for an opportunity to take off. The second he turned back completely to me, I slowly backed out. As I did, I continued to watch him to make sure he wouldn't see or hear me. Fortunately for me, I got away unseen. Once I made it back to the road, I ran the remaining 2+ miles back to my car, possibly the fastest I ever have in my life. Now I'm going to tell you the part that's going to make you call me stupid. When I returned home and thought about what I had saw, I thought it would be a bad idea to call the police. After all, what would I tell them? I was taking a dump in the woods and saw a guy digging a hole? At the time, I was sure they would blow me off, but the longer I dwelled upon it, I realized I was scared more than anything. I was a single woman living alone. If he found out who called the cops on him and they were unable to find anything, I could end up being the next person buried in those woods. So basically, I talked myself out of it. I made a compromise after a few days and decided to search the internet for any missing persons in our area or surrounding ones. If there were, I would make an anonymous call. For the next days and weeks, I continued to check but came up empty. I did end up finding out I lived in a pretty safe area. That was good. Nevertheless, I kept what I saw firmly in the back of my mind just in case anything popped up. Even though I continued running, I never went back to that road. I haven't even driven down it and hopefully never will. Anytime I even get near to that part of town, I break out into a sweat and my heart starts pounding. Not quite a panic attack, but darn close. In the 6 months since it happened, I often find myself second-guessing my decision. I can't help but think that I may have helped someone get away with a heinous crime. However, if I get anywhere near to making the call, I fall apart. Have I allowed my fear to make me an accessory to a crime? What would you all have done that day under those circumstances? Has anyone else reading this been put into this position? Please, everybody, don't hesitate to share your thoughts in the comments. After all, it's not too late for me to make that call. If you just discovered your whole life was a lie, what would you do? How would you act? How could you go on not knowing who you truly were? Would you be able to continue living? Would you ever be able to trust another human again? These are only a few of the myriad of questions I ask myself and pose to you. Before I go ahead, I'll provide a tad bit of background. I have been planning for a school-related trip to Europe for quite some time, and as part of that planning, I needed my birth certificate to get a passport. No birth certificate meant no trip, so it was very important that I get it. When I went to my parents and told them I needed it, they suddenly began attempting to talk me out of the trip. This was strange considering they had been the ones who had talked me into going in the first place. Their behavior had made me very suspicious. As the deadline to get my passport got closer and closer, my repeated requests for the certificate fell on deaf ears, and anytime I asked for a reason, they would change the subject. Finally, the last day for me to get my passport in time came, and I had had enough. I went to my parents and demanded they give me my birth certificate. When they tried to change the subject, I exploded on them and demanded it again. Since I have always been a quiet and calm child, my outburst shocked them, but it appeared to have finally worked. My father silently walked into his office and came out with it inside a manila envelope and said nothing to me as he handed it to me. I was so exasperated I said nothing either. Putting it quickly into my backpack, I hurried off to school. After school, I headed to the post office to finally get my passport. As I waited in line, I happened to open the manila envelope and pull out the birth certificate. Since I had never actually seen it, I was curious to see what it looked like. While I read through, I was confused by what I saw. When I looked at that line that listed my father's name, the one listed did not match my father's, and the same applied to my mother's name. For a second, I thought my father had perhaps given me his birth certificate by accident. I had never known my grandparents, so I thought for a moment that the names listed were theirs, but once I checked the line where my names were listed, my name was indeed there, but my last name was different. Now I was totally confused. Desperate, I looked at the birth date line and it matched. None of this made any sense, but it did seem to answer the questions I had about their evasiveness. Before I went anywhere, I was going to have to find out what was happening. I left the post office empty-handed, but not without a head full of questions. When I got home, I guess my face gave me away. The looks on my parents' faces told me they knew I had seen it. I attempted to be calm at first, but my emotions took over. I began attacking them with questions, not waiting for the answers. My mother approached me and attempted to calm me down, but my emotions were driving me mad. She stood silently while I ranted, and once it began to slow down, she asked me to join them at the table. I hesitated at first, but when she put her hand on my shoulder, I guess to reassure me, I sat down and braced myself for what I was about to hear. Then my father began to talk, and he asked if I could sit and listen and not say anything till he finished. I simply nodded in the affirmative and prepared myself for the unknown. Darling, although we are not your biological parents, we love you just as if we were. We adopted you when you were around 3 years old. We were unable to have children, and when we saw you, we fell in love with you right away. Regardless of what you're about to hear, never forget any of that, okay? Assuming he was looking for an answer, I nodded my head. If what I was about to hear was any more shocking than what I'd heard so far, I wasn't sure I'd be able to handle it. Your mother was a fine woman. She worked for me at the car wash. She was the kind of person that would light up a room by just being in it. She got pregnant with you barely out of high school, and she had had a hard time at first, but she got on her feet pretty quickly. Now, your daddy was her boyfriend at the time, but he couldn't handle being a father and ran off. Unfortunately, he died in a motorcycle accident not long after you were born. Your mother never knew about that. Actually, no one knew about that until a few years later. The thing is, darling, your birth mother didn't leave you by choice. She loved you more than anything. Your mama was really into health, and she ate well and jogged every day. One morning, she went on a run and never came back. I don't mean she ran off and left you. She just disappeared. The police looked for her for months, but they came up empty-handed. To this day, she's still considered a missing person. Since she nor your biological daddy had any family, you got put in the foster system. Your mother and I started off as your foster parents, while the whole time working through the courts to adopt you, and after a couple of years, we were finally able to. Once you started getting closer to school age, we moved here. We wanted to remove you from the ghost of your mama's disappearance and all the questions they may have brung up. Folks in small towns tend to talk a lot, and we knew sooner or later you'd be confronted by the past that you had no part in and was not your fault. Basically, we just wanted to protect you from the confusion that surely would have come along at some point. We did intend to tell you all this before, but the years just seemed to get away from us. We are truly sorry you had to find this out this way. You being mad at us is understandable, but please know we never meant for this to happen this way. When I gave you that birth certificate, I knew you'd figure this all out and we'd have to tell you the whole story. So like I said, we're deeply sorry you had to find out this way. So this is your turn. Do you have any questions to ask us? We don't want you to be in the dark about any of this. When he finished, I felt like I had been hit by a train. All that information at one time was almost too much to handle. I felt like if he said one more word, I'd scream. Questions, he asked. I sure did have questions. So many I didn't know where to start. My emotions cycled from furious to distraught, from confusion to wonder. I wanted to ask so many things, but I feared what would come out of my mouth and what else I'd hear. Despite my misgivings, I began to ask as many questions as I could think of, one by one, for almost 2 hours. We discussed anything I could think of, not always about what I just heard, but mostly. There were a few times I let my emotions overrule me, but for the most part I continued to talk as long as I could. As time went by, the anger that had been propelling me slowly transformed into joy. By the end of the day, I felt as though I had been given a precious gift. Perhaps the most precious of my life, and any lingering anger faded away into the ether. At the beginning of this post, I asked all of you how you would handle such life-changing news. In the short span of time between the post office and those 2+ hours talking at our family table, I must have asked myself all those questions and more 1,000 times. But since that day, my mind has been at the most peace it had ever been. Rather than hating my parents for hiding my past from me, I'm thankful to them. Like I said, I feel as though they have given me an undeniable gift. This entire situation has brought us closer together than we had ever been, and I am eternally grateful for that. Maybe I'll check on the progress of my mother's case when I get back from Europe. I'll try to keep the folks here up to date on what I find out. That's about all for me. Please never forget to keep your loved ones close. Thank you, and God bless you all. I'm posting this here in hopes of getting some outside perspective on my situation. I've been stuck inside this mess for so long I'm unable to tell fantasy from reality. Therefore, I'm here to get some help from the other posters and readers. For the sake of this post, you all can call me Parker. I'd like to be more forthcoming with my information, but for reasons you're soon to read, I'm unable to do anything that would risk people finding out my present location. Before I can tell you all here my immediate problem, I have to give you some basic facts from my past, so this will all make sense in the end. To start, I've been in an abusive marriage for over 10 years. For reasons I'm too embarrassed to tell, here I allowed a man who swore he loved me since way before our marriage to beat me on a regular basis for almost the entirety of the time we were married. The worst part of the entire mess is that he is a police officer and a well-respected one too. The few people I tried to tell about the abuse refused to believe a man of his standing could be doing something so vile. Not until he began leaving marks in more noticeable areas of my body did people around me finally acknowledge my assertions. I'll admit that I put up with the abuse for far longer than I should have, but as long as he kept his hands off our child, I could justify it. Unfortunately, the last time I became pregnant, one of his assaults went too far and caused me to lose the child. Despite the miscarriage obviously being his fault, he didn't seem to show any remorse for our loss. This, for me, was the final straw. After talking to a few of the other women at work, I was put in touch with a group that helped women get away from abusive spouses. The group and I talked back and forth for over a week and ultimately agreed on a day that I could get away with their assistance. One night when my husband was working the night shift, I grabbed my 5-year-old son and slipped out of the house and eventually out of the state. Now perhaps everyone can understand my reluctance to be too free with my identity. The whole first part of this story has been told in order to give readers some insight on the present problem I am experiencing, or not experiencing. Since I was a little girl, I've been a runner. All through middle and high school levels, I was part of the track team. Once I went off to college, I spent some time on the cross-country team and did very well, but eventually the time came to rejoin the track team. I found I preferred a nice clean track over a dirty trail and never turned back. When I got married, I took a few years off from running to focus on our home. But the time came I could no longer stand being so sedentary, so I got a new pair of shoes and hit the streets. In the time since I left my husband, I've done my best to keep my life as normal as possible, and that includes running. Again, I'll be a bit vague, but I'll say that I was recently running in an area that I've been living in, and I noticed a black car with dark-tinted windows parked in a cul-de-sac I was passing. At the time, I thought nothing of it being there, but the next day I left the place I'm staying, I noticed the same car parked about 50 yards down the street. At first, I stood and watched the car to see if it moved or did anything, but it stayed where it was. It was just far enough away so I couldn't see the driver clearly, but I believe it only contained one man sitting in the driver's seat, just sitting and doing nothing. Although I was somewhat curious, I realized it may have nothing to do with me. I wasn't familiar with the neighborhood after all, so I went ahead with my run. My most recent sighting of the car was this morning. While on my run, I was running down a street a few over from my current place, and I noticed that the mysterious car was slowly following me, or so I think, from about 20 yards behind. I kept running and would look back from time to time to see if he was still there. Once I came to the end of the street, the car sped around me and turned quickly to the right. The car took off and drove out of my sight. I couldn't help myself from watching it disappear from view. A small part of me expected the car to cut me off and the driver would jump out and grab me and pull me into the car. I know this may sound a tad paranoid, but my current situation had me extra nervous of the unfamiliar. Here's the point where I turn this all over to you. What do you think about this car and what may be happening? I'm fully aware that hypervigilance may sometimes bleed into overcautiousness, and this account may make me sound crazy. However, considering my past and present positions and my husband's special capabilities at finding those unwilling to be found, and his comrades' willingness to assist him in this endeavor, don't I perhaps have a valid reason to be scared? Maybe instead I'm suffering from PTSD and see danger everywhere. I'm really in need of the reader's input on this. The actions I choose to take can be life-altering, so there's no place for humor. Please feel free to put your 2 cents in, because my inability to make the proper decision in the right amount of time could cost me my life. I recently had an experience that many will not believe. Honestly, I'm not sure I actually do myself. My upbringing wasn't especially religious per se. We never attended church, but I'm sure if you asked my parents if we were a Christian family, they would have to say yes. It wasn't something I ever discussed with them, but I'd be willing to wager their view was similar to mine. My feeling is that a person's connection to the spiritual is personal and individual, and I guess my view on the spiritual would be the same. I'd assume you would have to believe in some form of afterlife to believe in ghosts or spirits. I'm not exactly positive of my view towards them, but I know what I just saw has made me question their existence in our world, and how and why they may share it with us. At the end of last week, I went for a run on a paved trail that surrounds a local neighborhood. I believe at one point the trail was part of a park in that area, but from what I've been told, the city closed the park due to low attendance. I guess the trail continued to be maintained by the city for the use of residents of the neighborhood, but it proved to be a popular attraction for everyone because it was lit all night. This feature made it a somewhat safer place for use after dark. I, myself, had run on it several nights I was unable to sleep. The morning this happened, it was about 4:30 and I had decided to knock out a few miles before dawn. Since it was the heart of summer, it would be sweltering by 9 a.m. and I've never ran well in the severe heat. Since it's less than a mile away from my house, I usually walk to the track. Doing this also gives me an opportunity to warm up before I reach it. I made it there around 4:15 and after a few minutes of stretches, set my watch timer at exactly 4:20. My custom is to start off slow, so I completed my first mile in roughly 9 or so minutes. As I began the second, I noticed a fellow jogger some 60 yards ahead running toward me. This wasn't especially odd on this trail. People were free to run either direction and often do. Once the jogger got closer, I could tell it was a man, thin and of average height. I gradually began to increase my pace and I was soon about to pass him. As I did so, I offered a friendly wave and hello, but rather than say hi and wave back, he continued on and appeared to ignore me. My initial reaction was to get huffy and mumble, "How rude," under my breath. He had to have seen and heard me. It was a quiet morning with no one around, and we were under a very bright overhead street lamp. Rather than slow down, I continued to increase my pace to my usual one and quickly glanced back at the man. I'm not sure why I did, but something in the back of my mind told me to do it, so I did. When I did, he was gone. This caught me by such surprise, I've stopped mid-stride and stared at where he should have been. I've never been so befuddled in my life. There was nowhere he could have gone. We both should have been directly within the light of the lamp and walls surrounding the back of the homes. There was only 2 or 3 feet of grass between the wall and the edge of the track, and even that area was well illuminated. This was about the time my confusion began to be replaced by fear, and other questions started creeping in. Did I just say hi and wave at a ghost? Did I even believe in them in the first place? Goosebumps covered my body and I started to shiver. I wondered then if perhaps this was all a joke and my confidence started to rise again. I called out and asked if he was still there and chuckled, "You can come out now." Despite the attempt at bravado, I knew this wasn't a prank. The little confidence I had regained in that moment quickly fizzled away and I was left alone, trembling in fear once more. This was about the time my brain told me to run away and I listened. I booked it out of there, going the opposite direction he was, of course, and didn't stop until I made it back home. By the time I made it back, my husband was getting up for work. Although I considered telling him what had happened, I didn't. I assumed he wouldn't believe me or he'd just laugh at me. He isn't a mean or uncaring husband, but considering we spend a considerable amount of our time joking around or pranking each other, I thought he would think I was tricking him. Now you know why I thought someone may have been pranking me. Unfortunately, in this case, no one was laughing. Now I wait until the sun rises before I go running. Hot or not, I never want to run into that guy again. I did return to the park track again a few days later, but with my 15-year-old daughter in tow. The entire time I was there, I was constantly looking around. My daughter asked me if I was having a seizure. Even though it was funny, I couldn't laugh because I had my mind on that man. I still haven't told anyone what I saw. You guys are the only people who know what I've seen, and I imagine you all don't believe me either. Even so, those of you who have had similar experiences in your life, never forget, even if no one else believes you, there will always be one person who will. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe and click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured in the next video. And join my Discord to interact with me and other listeners directly. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.